Danwon 7 was not the kind of place anyone dreamed about. It sat at the far edge of human space, a small world with gray plains that stretched in every direction, and an amber sky that never quite looked like home. 40,000 people lived there. They mined ore from deep underground. They grew grain in long fields that bent under the wind. They raised families in prefab houses that all looked the same. It was not beautiful, and it was not important, and that was exactly why most of the people there had chosen it. He had moved ammunition and food and fuel across star systems during 3 different conflicts, and then one day he had decided he was tired. He retired. He came to the quietest place he could find and sat behind a desk. People on the colony thought of him as a polite man who did boring work. That was fine with him. Hana ran the colony's only hospital. She was in her mid-30s, with sharp eyes and a tongue that could cut through steel. She had come to Danwon 7 because the inner worlds had too many doctors and not enough patients who actually needed help. Out here, she delivered babies, set broken bones, treated mining injuries, and kept the colony breathing with equipment that was 10 years out of date. She complained constantly, but never once thought about leaving. The people here needed her, and Hana was the kind of person who needed to be needed. Taesu was the head of the colonial militia, which was a generous name for 36 volunteers with old rifles and 1 patrol vehicle that broke down every other week. He was in his early 50s, built like a piece of mining equipment, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of the same gray rock that covered the plains. He had been a Marine once, a long time ago. Now he ran drills on weekends and spent the rest of his time hunting the small animals that lived in the rocky hills north of the settlement. He told bad jokes and laughed at them himself when nobody else did. And then there was Subin. She was 22 years old, fresh out of technical school, and she was the colony's communications officer. This meant she sat alone in a small room full of screens and listened to the void. Most days there was nothing. Cargo ship schedules, weather satellite data, routine check-ins from the nearest human outpost, which was 11 light-years away. Subin was nervous by nature. She jumped at strange sounds and worried about things that had not happened yet. People told her she needed to relax. She told them she would relax when there was nothing to worry about. On the morning that everything changed, Subin was eating noodles at her console when she noticed something strange. There was a signal at the edge of the system. It was faint, just a flicker in the subspace band, but it was not natural. Natural signals did not pulse in regular patterns. She put down her noodles and leaned forward. She ran the signal through 3 different filters, and the result was the same every time. Something was out there. Something that was not human. She called Yunho. He came to the comm room 20 minutes later, carrying a cup of tea. He looked at her data, asked her 3 quiet questions, and then nodded. He told her to keep watching and to tell no one yet. False readings happen sometimes out here. The edge of the system was full of old debris and strange energy pockets. There was no reason to frighten people over nothing. Subin wanted to argue, but she did not. Yunho had a way of making you feel like things were under control, even when you were not sure they were. She went back to watching. Over the next 24 hours, the signals multiplied. 1 became 3. 3 became 9. 9 became a number that Subin stopped counting because her hands were shaking too much. She called Yunho again. This time he did not bring tea. He stood behind her chair and looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. Then he picked up his comm and called Taesu. Taesu was cleaning his rifle in his small house at the edge of the settlement when the call came. He listened, asked 1 question, and then started putting on his boots. He did not ask if Yunho was sure. He had known Yunho for 9 years, and in all that time, the man had never once been wrong about anything that mattered. By the 2nd day, the signals had stopped. That was worse. Subin explained it to Yunho with wide eyes. When signals appeared and then disappeared, it meant one of two things. Either whatever was out there had left, or it had moved close enough that it no longer needed long-range communication. It was using short-range now, tight beam, the kind of signals you used when you were coordinating with units nearby. Yunho told Hana to quietly double her medical supplies. He did not explain why. Hana looked at him for a long moment, and then did it without asking. She had learned a long time ago that when quiet men started making preparations, it was wise to follow. That evening, the colony went about its business as it always did. Miners came home tired and dirty. Children played in the dusty streets between the prefab houses. Someone was cooking something spicy in one of the common kitchens, and the smell drifted across the settlement. A couple argued loudly in their home about whose turn it was to fix the water recycler. Life continued, because life did not know how to do anything else. Tasu stood on the ridge east of the colony. He had his rifle on his back, and his old military binoculars in his hands. He was not looking at the ground. He was looking up. The amber sky was fading into the deep purple of night, and the first stars were beginning to appear. He stood very still, breathing slowly, watching. And then he saw them. Bright streaks of light cutting across the sky, not one or two, dozens. They came in fast and hard, burning through the upper atmosphere in sharp white lines, spreading across the horizon like cracks in glass. Dropships, military formation. There was no mistaking it. Tasu lowered his binoculars. His face did not change. He had seen this before, a lifetime ago, on a different world. He reached for his comm unit and pressed the button. His voice was steady, quiet, almost bored. They're here. The sky above Danwan 7 burned white, and the quiet was over. They came down like a hammer on glass. The Vilhari were tall, nearly 7 feet, with hard plating on their skin that looked like bone and armor fused together. They had 4 arms, 2 large and 2 small, and their faces were flat and wide, with deep-set black eyes that did not blink. They moved fast for their size, and there were thousands of them. Dropships landed in the fields, crushing grain under burning engines. Armored walkers the size of houses stomped across the gray plains, shaking the ground with every step. Gunships screamed overhead, circling the colony like birds of prey. The whole thing took less than 4 hours. Commander Rothal stood in the center of the colony's main square and watched his soldiers drag humans out of their homes. He was tall, even for a Velhari, and he carried himself like someone who had never been told no. He had conquered 11 worlds for the Empire. Small worlds, soft worlds, worlds just like this one, with no fleets and no armies, and no reason for anyone important to care about them. Danwan 7 was just another name on his record, another easy victory. He looked around at the prefab houses, the dusty streets, the terrified faces of the humans being pushed to their knees, and he felt nothing but boredom. Yunho came forward with his hands raised. He walked slowly, calmly, with the same quiet expression he always wore. He identified himself as the colony administrator and asked in a polite voice what the Velhari wanted. Rothal looked down at him the way a person looks at an insect on a table. He told Yunho that Danwan 7 now belonged to the Velhari Empire. The humans would cooperate. The ore would be extracted. The colony would serve as a forward base for further expansion. Anyone who resisted would be killed. Yunho nodded. He said he understood. He asked if the civilians could be allowed to return to their homes. Rothal found him almost amusing. This small, soft man with his quiet voice and his polite questions. This was what the humans sent to lead their colonies. Pathetic. He waved his hand and allowed it. The civilians were released back to their houses under armed guard. Several, who had tried to fight during the landing, were left lying in the streets as a message. Hana's hospital was seized and turned into the Velhari Command Center. The building was the largest in the colony, and sat at its heart, which made it a natural headquarters. Hana was not removed. Rothal's officers needed medical support for soldiers who had been injured during the landing, mostly minor wounds from debris and rough landings. They told her to treat their wounded alongside the human patients. She looked at the alien soldier who delivered the order, said nothing, and got to work. Inside, her mind was already moving in directions the Velhari could not see. Tesu was not in the colony when it fell. When the dropships came, he had been on the ridge with 7 of his militia volunteers. They watched the invasion happen from a distance, and Tesu made the hardest decision of his life. He did not go back. He took his 7 people and disappeared into the mining tunnels that stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath the plains. The tunnels were old, deep, and mapped only in the memories of the miners who had dug them. No alien scanner would find them all. In the days that followed, the colony settled into a grim routine. The Velhari controlled everything. They set up checkpoints at every major intersection. Armed patrols walked the streets at all hours. A curfew was imposed. Humans were allowed to move only between their homes, their work sites, and the food distribution points. The mines were reactivated under Velhari supervision, and the humans were put to work extracting ore for their conquerors. Rothal sent his report to the Velhari High Command. Colony secured, minimal resistance, resources under control, staging operations proceeding ahead of schedule. He called it the easiest conquest in Velhari history. His superiors were pleased. But beneath the surface, in the spaces the Velhari did not look because they did not think they needed to, things were happening. Yun-Ho had been a logistics officer for 20 years. He understood systems. He understood how supplies moved, how information flowed, how organizations worked, and how they broke. He also understood something that Rothal did not. Compliance was not the same thing as defeat. A man who kneels because he chooses to can stand up again whenever he wants. He began with small things. He cooperated with every Velhari demand, filling out their forms and answering their questions with the same polite, boring efficiency he had always shown. He made himself invisible. Just a bureaucrat, just a paper pusher, not worth watching. And while he pushed papers, he changed numbers. Supply counts were off by small amounts. Full deliveries were delayed by hours that stretched into days. Equipment requests were filed incorrectly and had to be redone. None of it was obvious. All of it was deliberate. Hana moved through the colony on her medical rounds. The Velhari allowed it because they needed her to keep the human workers healthy enough to mine. She carried medicine and bandages. She also carried data chips hidden inside medical supply containers, messages written in a code that Yun-Ho had designed using old military encryption. She delivered them to people who needed them and collected information in return. How many guards at the north checkpoint? What time the patrols changed? Where the ammunition was stored? She smiled at the Velhari soldiers she passed, and they ignored her. She was just a doctor. Harmless. Subin had hidden herself during the invasion. When the dropships landed, she had crawled into a maintenance shaft beneath the communications building and stayed there, breathing dust and fear, for nearly 12 hours. When she finally came out, the Velhari had already jammed all outgoing signals. Every comm channel was dead. But Subin had built the colony's communication array herself, piece by piece, and she knew its systems better than anyone alive. She found a gap, a narrow band, barely a whisper, aimed at a relay satellite that the Velhari had not noticed because it was old and half-broken and listed as decommissioned in the colony's records. She sent a message. It was short. It contained the colony's name, its coordinates, and one word: invaded. She had no idea if anyone would hear it. The nearest human military outpost was 11 light-years away. The signal would take time to travel, and even if it arrived, there was no guarantee anyone would come. Danwan 7 was not important. It had no strategic value. It was just a small colony full of farmers and miners on a gray world that nobody cared about. But she sent it anyway, because that was all she could do. Days passed. The Velhari tightened their grip. More soldiers arrived. Construction began on permanent fortifications. Rothal walked through the colony like a king walking through his garden, and the humans lowered their eyes and said nothing. He never noticed the way Yunho watched him, not with fear, not with anger, with patience. The same patient, careful attention a hunter gives to an animal that does not yet know it is being studied. At night, Yunho sat in his small office and listened to the silence. Somewhere beneath the ground, Taesu and his people were waiting. Somewhere in the hospital, Hana was counting guards and memorizing schedules. Somewhere in a maintenance shaft, Subin was listening to the stars, hoping for an answer. The Velhari thought they had won. They had taken the colony in 4 hours and met almost no resistance. They had looked at these humans and seen exactly what they expected to see: weakness, submission, fear. They had not looked deeper. They had not asked themselves why a retired military officer was running a colony this far from home. They had not wondered why the doctor never cried. They had not questioned why the militia commander had simply vanished instead of dying heroically. They had not considered, even for a moment, that everything they were seeing was exactly what the humans wanted them to see. 2 weeks into the occupation, the Velhari believed they owned Danwan 7. They had built watchtowers at every corner of the settlement. Their armored walkers patrolled the perimeter in slow, heavy circles. Their gunships made sweeps across the plains twice a day, scanning for anything that moved. The ore was flowing. The humans were working. Everything was going according to plan. But the Velhari did not understand the ground beneath their feet. The mining tunnels of Danwan 7 went deep. Some of them had been dug in the first year of the colony's founding, nearly 30 years ago. They branched and split and reconnected in patterns that no single map could capture. The official records showed the main shafts and the active dig sites, and those were the tunnels the Velhari monitored. But the old shafts, the abandoned ones, the ones that the miners had dug by hand when the machines broke down, and nobody bothered to record, those tunnels existed only in the memories of the people who had made them. Taesu lived in those tunnels now. His group had grown from 7 to nearly 200. They came in 1s and 2s, slipping away from work crews during shift changes, vanishing into ventilation shafts and drainage pipes that led down into the dark. Miners mostly, men and women with hard hands and harder faces, who knew the rock like they knew their own skin. But there were engineers too, and mechanics, and a handful of militia volunteers who had avoided the initial roundup. They had no real weapons at first. What they had was the mine itself. Mining was dangerous work. The tools they used every day, plasma cutters, bore charges, industrial lasers, chemical solvents, were not designed to hurt people. But a plasma cutter that could slice through solid rock could slice through anything else just as easily. Bore charges that could shatter a vein of ore could shatter an armored walker's leg. Taesu did not need fancy military equipment. He needed people who understood pressure, timing, and the weight of stone. He got them. The first operation was simple. A Velhari patrol had been sent into the upper tunnels to inspect the ore extraction. 6 soldiers, fully armed, moving in standard formation through a shaft they had walked 3 times before. They walked it a 4th time, and the ceiling came down on them. 200 tons of gray rock, dropped with surgical precision by a set of bore charges, placed in the support beams 12 hours earlier. The shaft collapsed in a section barely 20 meters long. Nothing before it was damaged. Nothing after it was damaged. Just that one section, falling at exactly the right moment. The Velhari dug out the bodies 2 days later. Their weapons and armor were gone. Rothal was informed. He frowned, but did not panic. Cave-ins happened in mines. That was a known fact. He ordered additional structural scans and moved on. A week later, it happened again. A different tunnel, a different patrol. This time the collapse was followed by a power failure in the surrounding grid. And by the time the Velhari restored lighting, another 3 soldiers had vanished. Their bodies were found eventually, deep in a side shaft that was not on any map. They had been killed with their own weapons. Now Rothal was paying attention. He sent larger patrols. He deployed drones into the tunnels. He demanded the human miners provide complete tunnel maps. The miners cooperated. They handed over maps that were detailed, professional, and almost entirely useless. The maps showed the official tunnels perfectly. They showed nothing else. Above ground, the occupation continued. The Velhari imposed stricter rules. Movement was restricted further. Random searches became common. Soldiers stopped and questioned humans on the streets for no reason. Rations were cut as punishment for the tunnel incidents. The humans endured it. They lowered their eyes and said yes and went back to work. Hana continued her rounds. She treated human patients in the morning and Velhari wounded in the afternoon. She was professional and efficient with both. She did not complain. She did not resist. She walked through checkpoints with her medical bag and her tired expression, and the guards barely glanced at her anymore. She was part of the background. Furniture. Inside her medical bag, beneath the bandages and the antibiotics, she carried the colony's war. Data chips moved through her hands like blood through veins. Information from Yunho went down to Taesu. Information from Taesu's scouts came back up. Guard rotations, supply schedules, communication frequencies that Su Bin had intercepted from her hiding place. Hana memorized it all, delivered it all, and never wrote a single word on paper. Everything lived in her head, and her head was a fortress that no Velhari scanner could breach. She was tired. She had not slept more than 4 hours a night since the invasion. Her hands shook sometimes when she was alone, and she had to press them flat against a table until they stopped. But she did not slow down. She could not. Every piece of information she carried was a weapon, and weapons were what they needed. Yunho sat in his office and continued to be useless. That was how Rothal saw him. The little administrator who shuffled papers and asked permission for everything, and never made eye contact for longer than a second. Rothal had stopped thinking about him entirely. Yunho was a tool, a way to manage the human workers without having to speak to every one of them individually. Nothing more. But the supply chain was rotting from the inside. Yunho's false reports had created a web of small errors that multiplied with every cycle. Fuel was being delivered to the wrong locations. Spare parts for the walkers were listed as arrived, but sitting in storage containers on the wrong side of the settlement. Ammunition counts were off by margins just small enough to be blamed on clerical mistakes. Every time a Velhari officer complained, Yunho apologized profusely, corrected the error, and introduced a new one somewhere else. It was not sabotage. Sabotage was dramatic. This was erosion. Slow, invisible, like water wearing down stone. The third attack came from below, and this time it was not a cave-in. Taesu's people hit a Velhari supply depot that had been set up in an old mining chamber. They came through walls that were not supposed to have passages behind them, using tunnels so narrow that the miners had to crawl single file. They moved in total darkness, navigating by memory and touch. They took everything they could carry: power cells, communication equipment, ration packs, medical supplies, and vanished back into the rock before the alarm was raised. The Velhari found the empty depot and the holes in the walls, and for the first time, Rothal felt something cold settle in his chest. These were not random incidents. This was organized. This was planned. He ordered reprisals. 10 humans were pulled from their homes and executed in the main square as a warning. The colony was forced to watch. Yun-ho stood in the crowd and watched. His face did not move. His hands did not shake. He looked at the bodies of people he had known, people whose permits he had signed and whose complaints he had listened to, and he felt something so far beyond anger that it did not have a name. That night he went to Hana. She was in the hospital, cleaning blood off a table that was not hers. He closed the door and spoke in a voice so quiet that even the walls could not hear. Send the second message. Everything. Numbers, positions, rotations, weapon placements, supply routes, all of it. Hana looked at him. Her eyes were red. Her hands were steady. To who? Yun-ho looked at her, and for the first time in 2 weeks, something showed in his face. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was certainty. The people they should have been afraid of. Hana did not ask again. She took the data chip from his hand and walked out into the night. By morning, the information was in Subin's hands, and by the following evening, a whisper of light was traveling through the void, carrying the complete blueprint of the Velhari occupation toward the inner systems. Somewhere out there, past the empty light years and the silent dark, someone was listening, and they were already on their way. The UHN 4th Rapid Response Fleet did not appear on any public military register. It was not mentioned in recruitment materials. Politicians did not talk about it during speeches, and news networks did not cover its operations. It existed in the space between official records, in files that required clearance levels most admirals did not have. Its purpose was simple. When a human world was taken, the 4th Fleet took it back. It did not negotiate. It did not warn. It arrived, and then it was over. Admiral Do-yun commanded the fleet from the bridge of the heavy cruiser Baekdu. She was 61 years old, with short gray hair and a face that seemed permanently calm, as if nothing in the universe could surprise her anymore. She had held her rank for 14 years, and in that time had overseen the recovery of 9 colonies, the destruction of 4 hostile fleets, and the complete dismantling of a pirate confederation that had terrorized the Outer Rim for a decade. She never raised her voice. Officers who had served under her for years said they had never seen her angry. They also said that was the most frightening thing about her. The fleet had received Subin's original distress signal 11 days after it was sent. It took another 5 days to assemble and jump to the staging point outside the Danwon system. Do-yun used that time to plan. She studied the colony's layout from old survey data. She analyzed Velhari military doctrine from intelligence databases. She ran simulations. Then Yun-ho's intelligence package arrived, forwarded through Subin's hidden channel, and Do-yun allowed herself a thin smile for the first time in weeks. The package was extraordinary. It contained a complete picture of the Velhari occupation. Troop numbers down to individual squad assignments. Ship positions in orbit, ground vehicle deployments, patrol schedules accurate to the minute, ammunition reserves, fuel stores, communication frequencies, even the personal habits of Commander Rothal, when he ate, when he slept, which routes he walked through the colony, all of it gathered by a retired logistics officer, a colony doctor, a young comm technician, and 200 miners hiding in tunnels. Do-yun read the report twice. Then she called her senior officers to the bridge and laid out the operation. It would be fast. It would be simultaneous. And it would begin without a single word of warning. The Velhari had 3 cruisers and a light carrier in orbit around Danwon 7. They were positioned in a standard defensive formation, evenly spaced, covering the planet's approaches. Their sensors were active, and their weapons were online. Rothal was arrogant, but he was not completely stupid. He had maintained orbital security. It was not enough. The 4th Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel, at a distance so close to the planet that it violated every safety protocol in the Human Naval Handbook. 8 warships materialized in the void like ghosts, already at combat speed, already in attack formation, weapons already hot. The Velhari sensor officers had approximately 9 seconds between detecting the fleet and the first missiles hitting their hulls. 9 seconds was not enough time to do anything except die. The first cruiser lost its engines before its captain could reach the command chair. The second took a full broadside that punched through its hull in 6 places and vented 3 decks into space. The third managed to fire 1 shot, which missed, before a concentrated beam strike cut it nearly in half. The carrier, the largest ship in the Velhari formation, tried to launch fighters. Human electronic warfare systems blinded its launch systems and scrambled its internal communications. Boarding pods hit its hull 11 seconds later. Marine teams breached the carrier from 4 directions simultaneously. The boarding action lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, the carrier belonged to the humans. From start to finish, the orbital battle took less than 20 minutes. No human ships were lost. No human ships were seriously damaged. On the surface of Dan 17, Rothal was in his command center, Hana's hospital, reviewing mining output reports when his communications officer screamed. The officer was receiving signals from orbit, distress calls, weapon discharges, ships dying. Rothal lunged for the tactical display and watched as his orbital fleet was torn apart in real time. The icons representing his ships flickered and went dark, one after another, like candles blown out by a wind. His 4 hands gripped the edge of the table so hard the metal bent. Before he could issue a single order, the ground shook. Tae-Soo had been waiting for this moment for 23 days. The signal had come through Hana 2 hours ago. 1 word from Yunho, now. Everything happened at once. Bore charges detonated beneath the Velhari vehicle depot on the south side of the settlement, turning 12 armored walkers into burning scrap before their crews could reach them. The colony's power grid, which Yunho had quietly rerouted over the past week, went dark in every sector except the ones the resistance controlled. Communication relays were cut. 3 fuel storage tanks exploded in sequence, sending pillars of fire into the amber sky. And from every tunnel entrance, every ventilation shaft, every drainage pipe, Tae-Soo's people poured out. They were armed with stolen Velhari weapons and mining tools, and the desperate fury of people who had been kneeling for 3 weeks and had never once forgotten how to stand. They hit the Velhari patrols from directions that did not exist on any map, emerging from the ground itself like something out of a nightmare. The Velhari soldiers were trained professionals. They reacted quickly, forming defensive positions and returning fire. But they were fighting an enemy they could not see, in a colony that had turned against them, with no air support, no orbital backup, and a command structure that was falling apart by the second. Then the sky opened again. Drop pods screamed through the atmosphere, like falling stars. They hit the ground in a ring around the settlement, cracking the earth, and before the dust had settled, the hatches blew open. Human Marines stepped out. They wore powered armor that made them 7 feet tall and half as wide. Their helmets had no visible face, just a flat black visor that reflected nothing. They moved in perfect synchronization, squads flowing across the terrain like water, covering angles, eliminating threats, advancing without pause. Their weapons did not make the loud, bright sounds of Velhari guns. They made short, sharp cracks, and whatever they hit stopped existing. A Velhari squad leader rallied his troops behind a barricade near the main square. He had 15 soldiers, good soldiers, veterans. They set up overlapping fields of fire and prepared to hold their ground. 2 Marines came around the corner of a building and killed all 15 of them in 4 seconds. They did not slow down. They moved through the Velhari position like wind through dry grass and kept going. Rothal watched the feeds from his command center and felt something he had never felt in his entire military career. Fear. Not the sharp fear of a close call or a difficult battle. A deep, cold, structural fear. The kind of fear that came from realizing that everything you believed about the world was wrong. He had come to this planet and conquered it in 4 hours and thought he had understood what humans were. Soft, weak, compliant. He had stood over them and felt nothing but contempt. Now he watched Marines tear through his defensive lines like they were made of paper. He listened to his officers scream for reinforcements that did not exist. He saw Tesu's miners emerge from the ground with alien weapons in their hands and murder in their eyes. And above it all, in orbit, Duyun's fleet sat in perfect silence, having destroyed his entire naval force in the time it took to make a meal. These were not the same species. They could not be. The humans he had conquered were sheep. These things, these armored nightmares that moved through the dark without sound, that fell from the sky without warning, that tore his army apart with mechanical precision, these were something else entirely. He did not understand yet. He would. The sheep and the wolves were the same animal. The humans had simply been waiting to show him which one they really were. Rothal grabbed Hana and 6 civilian workers from the hospital. He barricaded the doors and the windows. He put a weapon to Hana's head and opened a communication channel. "Come closer, and they die." Hana stood very still. Her heart was pounding, but her face was the same face she had worn for 3 weeks. Calm, steady, unreadable. Somewhere outside, the guns went quiet. And then, through the static, a voice. Soft, female, patient. Admiral Do-yun was on the line. Do-yun's voice came through the channel like cold water. It was not loud. It was not angry. It carried no emotion at all, and that made it worse than any threat Rothal had ever heard. "You have taken our people. You have hurt our people. There will be no negotiation. There will be a consequence." Rothal gripped Hana's arm tighter, his weapon pressed against her temple. Around him, his last remaining soldiers stood behind overturned tables and equipment racks, their forearms holding rifles that shook in their hands. The hospital was sealed. Every door was blocked. Every window was covered. He had 6 human hostages kneeling on the floor with their hands behind their heads. He had leverage. That was what he told himself. As long as he had hostages, the humans would not act. That was how it worked. That was how every species in the galaxy operated. You threaten what the enemy values, and the enemy stops. But something in Do-yun's voice told him that this was not going to work the way he thought it would. He broadcast again. "I want a ship. I want safe passage to the system boundary. I want—" The channel clicked. Do-yun was gone. In her place, silence. Rothal stood in the dim light of the hospital, surrounded by his terrified soldiers and his terrified hostages, and waited. Nothing happened. No response, no counteroffer, no demands, just silence, stretching out like a wire pulled tight. Then the front door of the hospital opened. No explosive breach, no flash grenades, no Marines in powered armor. Just the door, swinging open slowly, and a man walking through it, alone, unarmed, hands at his sides. "You know." Rothal stared at him. The colony administrator, the paper pusher, the most boring, harmless, forgettable human on this entire planet. He was wearing the same plain gray jacket he always wore. His hair was uncombed. He looked like he had just come from his office, which he had. "What are you doing?" Rothal demanded. Yunho stopped about 10 paces from the barricade. He stood there the same way he had stood on the first day of the invasion, when he had walked forward with his hands raised and surrendered the colony. Calm, polite, patient. "Commander Rothal," he said, in the same quiet voice he used for everything. "I am here to explain your situation to you." Rothal almost laughed. Almost. But something stopped him. Something in the man's eyes. They were the same eyes that had looked at him for 3 weeks from behind that desk, filling out forms, and answering questions, and saying yes sir, and no sir. But now, standing in the doorway of this hospital, with gunfire fading in the distance, and the Velhari Empire burning around him, Rothal saw those eyes clearly for the first time. There was no fear in them. There was no anger. There was something much worse. There was certainty. The absolute, unshakable certainty of a man who already knows how this ends. You have approximately 4 minutes before the Marine assault teams breach this building, Yunho said. His tone was conversational, almost friendly. I have been authorized by Admiral Doyun to inform you of the rules of engagement that will apply during that breach. He paused, as if checking a mental list. In a hostage recovery operation classified as Priority 1, which this is, Marine units are authorized to use lethal force against all armed individuals in the target zone without warning or identification challenge. They will enter from the roof, the basement, and both lateral walls simultaneously. They will use concussive charges to disorient defenders, followed by targeted elimination of anyone holding a weapon. The average time between breach and clearance in a Priority 1 operation is 90 seconds. He said all of this in the same voice he used to discuss grain shipment schedules. In the event that hostages are harmed during the breach, the operation is reclassified as Priority 0. Under Priority 0 rules, there are no prisoners. The entire hostile force within the target zone and within a 300-meter radius of the target zone is to be eliminated regardless of surrender status. Rothal's soldiers were looking at each other. Their weapons were shaking harder now. Yunho took one step closer, just one. His hands remained at his sides. You came to our world and you took it because you thought we were weak. You looked at our farmers and our doctors and our children, and you saw prey. Many species have made that mistake. He paused. None of them have made it twice. The room was silent. The sound of distant gunfire had stopped completely. Somewhere above, Rothal could hear the faint hum of a ship hovering, waiting. The Marines were in position. The clock was running. Rothal looked at Yunho. He looked at Ha-Na, still standing with a weapon against her head. Ha-Na looked back at him with her sharp, tired eyes, and he realized something that shook him more than anything else that had happened today. She was not afraid either. She was not praying. She was not crying. She was looking at him with the expression of someone who already knew she was going to be fine. As if the weapon against her head was a minor inconvenience. As if she had known, from the very first day, that this moment would come, and that it would end with her walking out of this room and him being carried out. Rothal thought about the last 3 weeks. He thought about the polite administrator who had smiled and signed papers, the doctor who had treated his soldiers while carrying secrets in her bag, the miners who had handed over fake maps and then killed his patrols from tunnels that did not exist, the comm technician who had sent a signal through equipment that was supposed to be broken. He had been surrounded by enemies every single day, and he had not seen a single one of them. That was the thought that broke him, not the fleet in orbit, not the Marines outside, not the knowledge that his entire occupation force was being destroyed. It was the understanding that he had never been in control, not for 1 second. From the moment he had landed on Danwan 7, he had been standing in a trap, and the people he had conquered had been the ones holding it shut. He lowered his weapon. He told his soldiers to lower theirs. Ha-Na stepped away from him and walked calmly to the hostages and began checking them for injuries, as if this were just another shift at the hospital. Yunho nodded. He turned around and walked back out the door. The Marines entered 30 seconds later and took Rothal and his soldiers into custody. None of them resisted. 3 hours later, the battle for Danwan 7 was over. The Velhari occupation force was dismantled completely. Those who survived were taken prisoner. Those who did not were buried in the gray earth they had tried to steal. Rothal was brought aboard the Baekdu in restraints. He was taken to a plain room with a single table and 2 chairs. Admiral Do-yoon was waiting for him. She was smaller than he had expected. A human woman in a dark uniform with gray hair and a face that showed nothing. She sat across from him and folded her hands on the table. Your government will receive a message within the hour. It will contain coordinates. Specifically, the coordinates of every Velhari colony, military installation, and supply depot within range of my fleet. Rothal felt his blood go cold. This is not a threat, Do-yoon continued, in that same soft voice. It is information. I am giving your leaders the same information you had about us before you came here. The difference is that I am also giving them a choice, which is more than you gave the people of Danwon 7. She leaned forward, just slightly. You came to our world because you thought we were weak. You conquered farmers and doctors and children, and you called it victory. Now go home. Tell your leaders what you found here. Tell them what happens next time. Rothal said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was returned to a Velhari ship and sent back to his own space. He carried no weapons, no intelligence, and no pride. Only a message. On Danwon 7, the rebuilding began. It was slow, the way everything on the colony was slow. The prefab houses were repaired. The fields were replanted. The mines were reopened under human control. Funerals were held for those who had not survived the occupation, and the colony grieved together in the quiet way that people grieve when they have no time to stop working. Yunho went back to his desk. He filed reconstruction permits and supply requests and infrastructure reports. He drank his tea. He answered questions in his quiet voice and signed forms with his neat handwriting, and was, by all appearances, exactly the same boring administrator he had always been. Hana restocked her hospital. She ordered new equipment, trained 2 new nurses, and complained about the quality of the medical supplies the fleet had left behind. She worked 16-hour days, and told anyone who asked that she was fine. Subin installed a new communication array, 3 times as powerful as the old one, with backup systems and encrypted channels that would take any alien species years to crack. She was still nervous. She still jumped at strange sounds. But she no longer apologized for it. Taesu trained his new militia. It was no longer 36 volunteers with old rifles. It was 300, with proper equipment, proper training, and a network of fortified positions in the tunnels that could hold against anything short of an orbital bombardment. He still told bad jokes. Nobody laughed at them except him. That had not changed. 6 weeks after the liberation, a transmission arrived at the colony's comm center. Subin opened it, read it, and brought it to Yunho. It was a formal diplomatic communication from the Velhari government. The language was careful, respectful, and contained none of the superiority that had defined every previous Velhari communication with humanity. Yunho read it. He read it again. Then he nodded, set the document on his desk, and poured himself a cup of tea. Outside his window, the amber sky stretched over the gray plains. Children were playing in the streets again. Someone was arguing about the water recycler. A miner was walking home with dust on his face and tiredness in his bones. Life was continuing because life did not know how to do anything else. Danwon 7 was quiet again, but the galaxy remembered. And in the halls of every alien government that received the reports, in every military academy that studied the battle, in every war room where strategists pointed at star maps and debated which species to threaten next, one lesson had been carved into the record in letters that would never fade. Do not touch the humans. Not because of their ships, not because of their marines, not because of their weapons or their technology or their fleet. Because of their farmers, because of their doctors, because of their miners and their comm technicians, and their quiet little administrators who smile and nod and sign your papers and wait. The ships were terrifying, but the ships go home. The people stay, and the people remember. That was what made them monsters.